For most of human history, battles slipped into oblivion, leaving no trace behind. The prehistoric world preserved neither the names nor the feats of its warriors, and even the earliest written sources mention warfare only briefly and without detail. It was not until the Egyptians carved reliefs into the walls of a temple along the Nile that history gained its first known detailed account of a battle. From these carvings emerges a remarkable story. Word soon spread of an Egyptian advance. As the pharaoh emerged from the desert, leading his powerful army north through the city of Gaza, beyond him stretched harsh and rugged terrain. All that stood between his forces and the great hilltop stronghold of Megiddo, where thousands of enemy troops lay in wait. The young pharaoh, Thutmose III, carefully weighed his options. The temple annals record that his generals urged him to take only the safe roads leading north and east, warning him against the dangerous path. They reminded him that 2 secure routes were available, and begged him not to force the army onto the most treacherous road. Yet Thutmose knew of a third route, the narrow passes of Aruna, hemmed in by jagged hills and highly vulnerable to ambush. At its exit, this path nevertheless led almost directly to the foot of the enemy city. Although he had ruled Egypt alone for only a few months, Thutmose's authority carried divine weight, for he was believed to act under the mandate of his heavenly father, the great god Amun-Ra. The army therefore followed their king into the perilous pass. Ranks pressed tightly together, chariots were dismantled and hauled by porters and pack animals, and a scribe carried a scroll on which he would record the campaign, a battle that would change Egypt's fate. The soldiers were only days away from the Battle of Megiddo. Armies like the pharaohs were extremely vulnerable to ambush if they failed to scout ahead and remain vigilant, much like the way many people today approach the internet without protection. As Thutmose advanced, rulers beyond Egypt sensed weakness at the top of the throne. With Thutmose III newly proclaimed as sole pharaoh, the prince of the distant city-state of Kadesh seized the moment. Supported by Egypt's rival, the Mitanni Empire, the prince gathered a coalition of fragmented Canaanite tribes from Syria and concentrated them at the fortified city of Megiddo. From this position, the alliance could sever Egypt's access to vital resources, such as specialized timber for chariots and tin for bronze weapons. There may even have been plans to carry the war directly into Egypt and bring conflict to the banks of the Nile itself. Thutmose intended to strike before that could happen. Until now, he had ruled only as co-regent alongside the powerful female pharaoh Hatshepsut, his stepmother and aunt, and the wife and sister of his late father. Her reign had brought great prosperity to Egypt, centered at Thebes, where she built the magnificent temple that bore her name. For 15 years, laborers and architects carved shrines and column terraces into the mountainside, linked by a grand causeway lined with kneeling statues and sphinx. In the lower courtyard, gardens swayed beside shimmering pools. These monuments may have pleased the gods, but they could not deter Egypt's enemies. Hatshepsut was gone, and the crown now belonged to Thutmose alone. He moved quickly to raise an army whose warriors were trained by experienced officers and organized into disciplined divisions. Although pharaohs of this era typically conscripted 1 in every 10 men, many soldiers volunteered willingly, drawn by the promise of plunder, land, and slaves. Together, the troops and their supply train marched north along the Nile in the spring of 1458 BC. For centuries, the river had cut a green lifeline through the surrounding desert, flooding its banks each year and leaving behind vast stretches of fertile soil that sustained Egyptian civilization. The people worked rich, fertile land, harvesting overflowing fields of wheat and barley that produced the core of the Egyptian diet, bread and beer. Thutmose understood a hard truth: this kingdom had never endured without bloodshed. Narmer, or Menes, was the first ruler to unite Upper and Lower Egypt around 3000 BC, and a ceremonial palette depicts him towering over defeated enemies, their severed heads and genitals placed in humiliation at his feet. Not long after his reign, Egypt entered its first great golden age, the Old Kingdom, when early pharaohs commanded the construction of the pyramids at Giza. These colossal monuments were assembled from millions of enormous stone blocks, once sheathed in gleaming white limestone, surrounded by grand temples, causeways, and the imposing Great Sphinx. Though these pyramids were already more than 1,000 years old by the time of Thutmose, daily life in Egypt continued much as it had for centuries. Farmers tended crops and livestock, priests honored an ever-evolving pantheon of gods, and the dead were ritually prepared for their journey into the afterlife. Yet something had changed. Egypt no longer felt as unshakable as it once had. Following a second golden age known as the Middle Kingdom, Semitic-speaking Hyksos from the Levant seized control of northern Egypt around 1650 BC. The mighty strongholds of earlier dynasties crumbled into ruin, and valuable mines and quarries were abandoned. It was the Theban dynasty that resisted this foreign domination. With a growing army reinforced by desert mercenaries, the Theban kings issued a fierce warning to the Hyksos, vowing to deny them access to the fields, to drink the wine of their vineyards, destroy their settlements, and cut down their trees. After a century of occupation, the House of Thebes reclaimed Egypt and expelled its four rulers. Now, only a few generations later, Egypt faced another challenge from the Levant. Once again, a coalition formed under the Prince of Kadesh. Pharaoh Thutmose III gathered his army on the edge of the desert at the ancient fortified outpost of Jaru. This force may have numbered more than 10,000 warriors, each marching to bring destruction upon Egypt's enemies. Leaving behind the whitewashed mud brick walls of the fortress, the army advanced into the desolate Sinai, beginning the long 150-mile march toward Gaza. Years of Hyksos rule had reshaped Egyptian warfare, and the army now adopted foreign innovations. Horses had become widespread, ushering in the use of lightweight, highly maneuverable chariots optimized for drivers and archers. Ranged infantry units, strengthened by skilled Nubian mercenaries, wielded powerful composite bows alongside traditional self-bows. Still, the backbone of the pharaoh's military power remained its masses of melee infantry, mostly unarmored soldiers carrying hide-covered shields and fighting with bronze spears, axes, and the recently adopted kapish, the distinctive sickle-shaped sword. Day after day, the troops endured the scorching sands, their exhausting march eased only by the cool desert nights. These men went to war sustained by faith in divine order. They believed the gods ruled both this world and the next, that hearts weighed down by sin would be devoured after death, while the worthy would be welcomed by Osiris into the blissful field of reeds. They trusted that anyone who fell in this campaign would die fulfilling the righteous command of the divine king, Thutmose III. After 10 days of marching, the army reached Gaza. Despite unrest across the region, the city remained loyal to Egypt, allowing the troops time to rest and resupply. But secrecy could not last forever. As the army pushed north, word of their presence spread, and enemy chariot forces from Canaan and Syria threatened interception. Nearly 3 weeks into the campaign, Thutmose and his army arrived at Yem, where 3 possible routes led toward Megiddo. Scouts were sent ahead, and the pharaoh summoned his generals, warning them that the enemy Prince of Kadesh had already entered Megiddo and gathered the rulers of lands once loyal to Egypt. The generals urged their king to advance by one of the 2 wider, safer roads. They cautioned that the narrow and direct route through the Aruna Pass would compress their formations, leaving them vulnerable to destruction by coalition forces waiting at the exit. Soon, however, fresh intelligence returned from the scouts' reports. That seemed to harden Thutmose's resolve. Addressing his army, the young pharaoh commanded them to keep pace with their victorious lord, even as the road narrowed to a dangerous constriction. Taking his place at the front, Thutmose III personally led the army into the Aruna Pass. Despite the obvious dangers of this route, the surrounding hills offered concealment for much of the advance toward the city. Moving across open ground carried its own set of hazards. The Canaanite and Syrian forces relied on heavier, less agile chariots, similar in concept to those of Egypt, while their infantry wielded familiar weapons, bows, spears, axes, and curved sickle swords. The southern wing of the enemy army guarded the road to Tanach, while the northern wing positioned itself in the Kina Valley, the very valley into which the Egyptian army now descended. Yet, astonishingly, their arrival met no resistance. Thutmose may have slipped past the enemy by veering north through an alternate exit hidden by the terrain. But whatever the case, for several hours the Egyptian host poured unchallenged onto the plain, having failed to halt the pharaoh's approach. The enemy forces withdrew to their camp as daylight began to fade. The annals record that the Egyptians made camp along the banks of a stream. Guards were posted, rations distributed, and a formal camp established for His Majesty. A command was issued to the entire army. Prepare yourselves, ready your weapons, for battle would be joined with the wretched enemy at first light. At dawn, the opposing army formed its lines. Behind them loomed Megiddo in the distance, a city so strong and so perfectly positioned that it was said to be worth 1,000 cities. Soon, the sound of Egypt's advancing army thundered through the valley. The records proclaim that His Majesty rode forth in a chariot of electrum, clad in his weapons of war like Horus, the smiter, lord of power, and like Montu of Thebes, while his divine father Amun strengthened his arms. Pharaoh Thutmose III took his position at the center of the army, and together the main force advanced toward the southern end of the ridge upon which Megiddo stood. The precise tactics of the opening clash were not recorded, but the sequence of battle is clear. Archers moved to the front, sending volleys of arrows into the Syrian and Canaanite ranks. The enemy replied in kind, until waves of Egyptian infantry surged forward, crashing into their shaken lines. Amid blaring horns and shouted commands, warriors armed with axes and sickle swords hacked into shields and split flesh. Chariots from both sides thundered across the battlefield, weaving through gaps in the lines and cutting down anyone who crossed their path. Before long, the fighting collapsed into a slaughter as the enemy formations broke under the relentless Egyptian assault. An inscription later found in Nubia records the words, "At Megiddo, my majesty attacked them, and they fled, falling in heaps." Thutmose had earlier dispatched a detachment northwest of the city to block escape in that direction. Trapped and panicked, the Canaanite and Syrian forces fled toward the walls of Megiddo, leaving behind overturned chariots, arrows jutting from bodies, severed limbs, and groaning wounded scattered across the field. Yet at this critical moment, the Egyptians forfeited an immediate and total victory. It was written that their hearts became consumed by greed. Like crows descending on carrion, they swarmed across the battlefield, stripping the fallen of their valuables. Meanwhile, the fleeing enemy reached Megiddo, whose gates had already been shut. Desperate hands lowered ropes made from garments, hauling survivors up the walls. The records state that the wretched enemy of Kadesh was dragged hastily into the city, for fear of His Majesty had entered their hearts. Their strength failed them, and the royal diadem, the serpent of Thutmose, had overcome them. With the enemy still holding Megiddo, the pharaoh issued a new command. The city would be placed under siege. Megiddo stood on high ground, and though its core walls were old mud brick from the Middle Bronze Age, they were reinforced with newer stone structures. In places, the fortifications rose over 25 feet high and measured more than 12 feet thick. Siege armies of the age could batter gates and assault walls with ladders, but they lacked the means to shatter such defenses outright. Thutmose chose starvation as his weapon. He ordered his army to encircle the city with a ditch and a wall of freshly cut timber. As the siege lines closed in, officials carefully recorded the spoils of victory. 924 chariots, some painted and others adorned. With gold, more than 2,000 horses. The royal tent of the Prince of Kadesh himself. Human plunder in the form of 340 prisoners of war and 83 severed hands proudly collected from the dead. Even the annals themselves pause to emphasize how extraordinary Thutmose's record-keeping truly was. Every action taken by His Majesty against this town, against that wretched enemy and his miserable army, was documented meticulously day by day, campaign by campaign, unit by unit, recorded by individual troop commanders. All of it was written down on a leather scroll and preserved in the Temple of Ammon, where it remains to this day. Spring burned its way into summer, and still the siege dragged on. Thutmose dispatched forces against 3 additional hostile towns in the region, tightening his grip on the land. From time to time, starving civilians staggered out from their besieged cities, and the pharaoh showed clemency, granting them pardon. His goal was not the annihilation of these peoples, but the enforcement of loyalty, control over critical trade routes, and the steady flow of tribute. After months of pressure, Megiddo and the 3 defiant towns finally capitulated to Thutmose. The annals dramatize the submission of the region in vivid language. The princes of these foreign lands came crawling on their bellies, kissing the earth in praise of His Majesty and begging for the breath to continue living. Thutmose seized their wealth, grain, cattle, and treasure, and then stripped them of political power, appointing new rulers throughout the region. It was said that when he allowed the people to return to their towns, they traveled on donkeys. Because the pharaoh had confiscated every last horse, the Egyptian army then began its long march home, burdened with staggering spoils. Flawless treasure, nearly 2,000 slaves, tens of thousands of animals, and vast stores of harvested wheat. In Thebes, the long-awaited return of the king was marked by proclamations of victory. The city erupted into celebration, with feasts attended by nobles, musicians, and dancers. Many of his followers knew the king by his throne name. Menkaper, enduring, is the manifestation of Ra. The pharaoh was believed to be the son of the supreme creator god Ra, whose authority was symbolized by a sun disk encircled by a cobra. Just as the sun sustained life, the throne of Egypt was defended with divine fury and venom. The Battle of Megiddo had decisively reasserted Egyptian dominance in the Levant, but holding that power required constant action. Rival lords repeatedly challenged Egyptian authority across Syria and Canaan, and year after year, Thutmose returned to crush them. He constructed a formidable fleet to move strike forces swiftly along the coast and maintained a network of fortified strongholds throughout the region. Megiddo was only the first of 17 military campaigns he would lead there over the course of 2 decades. These relentless victories opened the gates of distant trade, brought torrents of tribute, and drew gifts from Babylonia, the Hittite Empire, and Assyria. Turning his gaze south, Thutmose also extended Egyptian control deep into Nubia. Many powerful rulers had once sat upon Egypt's throne, but it was Thutmose III who forged an empire. His image spread across his flourishing realm as the aging pharaoh turned his energies toward monumental construction. At the great temple complex of Karnak, he added the sacred light, towering pylons guarded by colossal statues, soaring granite obelisks, and the inscriptions that immortalized his military triumphs, especially the Battle of Megiddo. The end of his reign, around 1425 BC, was recorded in the tomb of an officer, The king had completed his long lifetime, magnificent in valor, strength, and victory. From year 1 to year 54, he ascended to heaven, united with the sun, his divine body merging with the God who had begotten him. In the centuries that followed, those who passed through the seventh pylon at Karnak gazed upon the commanding image of the greatest warrior in Egyptian history, Thutmose III. And there, more than 3,000 years later, it still stands. Asterisk.